So the external auditor is auditing financial statements. This is their main subject matter, right? But an external auditor will also look at the internal controls. Of course, the testing level is not as detailed as an internal auditor would do, but they still look at internal controls. So my question is, why are they still concerned about internal controls, and why can't they just do financial statements audit? That is because an external auditor is going to look at only those internal controls that have a direct effect on the preparations of financial statements. Okay, so which means HR related controls, right? Human resource department or marketing department or recruitment cell. So all these controls, see, there are internal controls in these different processes as well, but then they do not have a direct effect on the financial statement. So what are those internal controls that have direct effect on the financial statement? Purchaser system, right? Sales system, payroll system, not HR, but payroll, because payroll is a cost to the company and it is an expense in the statement of profit and loss, so it has a direct effect. What else? We have cash and bank. See, there are many other what do you say, accounts, but in your fundamental level of audit, you will be studying only few of them, and then in advance, if you choose AAA as one of your optional paper, then you will have more accounts that you will learn later on. Then there is non-current assets or PP&E, right? So there are internal controls for even these processes, obviously, just like how there are internal controls for other non-financial departments, which could be the head office, the corporate office, the marketing department, HR department. These are all non-financial functions. But then the auditor is only concerned with the internal controls on purchases, sales, payroll, cash and bank, and PP&E systems, because these have the direct effect on the financial statement. So that is why, because if the financial statements, if you want to check if the financial statements are prepared correctly or not, you'll have to first of all see whether the internal controls on these different items are functioning correctly or not. Only then purchases will be reported correctly, sales will be reported correctly, and it goes on, right? Whereas an internal auditor will not just look at purchase, sales, payroll, or just financial related processes, but they will also look at non-financial related operations and processes. So I hope everyone is clear with this. Okay. So I hope the management responsibility is understood by everyone and how that's different from an auditor's responsibility. Now, moving forward, we then looked at the different methods of recording the internal control processes. So this particular person is going to one of the client and he needs to now understand how is the purchase system working in your organization. See, more or less, it is the same in all the organizations, but then it can be certain processes will exist, certain processes will not exist. Okay, like in a purchase system, there might be 5 different types of controls. But if the organization is not that big, then they might not have all the 5 different controls, they might have just 4 of it. Or if the organization is really huge, then maybe they will have some additional controls. Okay, so that is why it's important that for every client that the auditor is visiting and understanding the internal control systems happens during the interim stage. Everybody remembers interim audit, right? The interim visit that happens few months before the year end, the financial year end. So ICSS, internal control systems. So understanding of internal control systems is done during the interim stage. And while you're understanding, mostly it is going to be vocal or, orally, that you would have to sit down with your client and try to understand how the purchase process works in the organization, how the sales process works. So you can't just document, I mean, you can't just have it or record it. That's not so accepted mode of, what do you say, documenting. So the better way of documenting these controls would be to either write it down or, yes, you have to make it descriptive, right? So that is why you have different methods. That's where we were in the last class, isn't it? This is what we were discussing. This is where we stopped. Okay, so you have 4 different methods, 1, 2, 3, and 4. What was the first one that we discussed? We had finished our discussion on the very first method for documenting internal control systems, which was, anybody who remembers?
Written representation.
No. Written representation is not one of the methods. It is a kind of audit evidence that the auditor obtains from the client as a disclaimer or as an acknowledgement of various management's responsibilities. So written representation is a different thing, a different audit documentation. It is not related to internal control systems. Anybody else who remembers the method that we discussed?
Narrative notes.
Yes, very good. So it is narrative notes. So this was discussed in the previous class. We discussed its merits and demerits as well. From exam perspective, what type of question can you expect from this particular area? They can, from the methods, they can directly ask you to write down. They can just directly ask you to write down 1 advantage, 1 disadvantage, or 2 or 3 advantages, disadvantages for narrative notes and flowcharts, or maybe some other 2 different methods. So the second method is called as flowchart method, which we will, this is where we will start from today. Then the third method is called as the questionnaire method. And the last one is called as the checklist. Questionnaire and checklist is more or less the same. Questionnaire will can be both types again. I'm sure all of you have filled some sort of questionnaires. Yeah. So in that you would see there are certain questions, and that you either have yes or no, or maybe that kind of an option to choose from. And a checklist is also where you have a list of questions but you'll have to tick boxes. So it's more or less the same. We'll look at that today. So this usually comes for around 2 to 4 marks maximum. So you'll have to learn or by heart these advantages and disadvantages for your exam. Learn what they are, learn the definition. You don't have to exactly write the textual definition. It could be in your own words as long as it makes sense, and learn the merits and demerits. Okay, so let's go to our LMS and then start the discussion from flowchart. So we had already covered narrative notes. Flowcharts, on the other hand, are graphical representation of internal control systems. Okay, so there you have to use a particular sort of, what do you say, diagrams or symbols. Okay, let me try to show you one example. Anybody who has already worked on flowcharts before? Not really. Okay. This is a small illustration of how a flow chart looks like. So as you can see here, there are two individuals, probably they are from the sales department because we can see sales in this. Sales ledger, sales invoice. So there's one person called Mr. Smith, another Mr. Jones, invoice set and prepared, details agreed maybe by Mr. Jones. So invoice is prepared by Smith, and then if the details are agreed and the accounting entries are posted by another person. Okay. So as you can see here, it is a visual representation, right? So what happens if you compare flowcharts to narrative notes? It is going to be more, you can understand the entire system quite quickly, right? Rather than, reading the entire lecture notes, which was going to be a time-consuming process. And another thing is that you can easily spot out any kind of missing control activities in the flowcharts. So this also has certain advantages and disadvantages. Like one, I told you already two advantages. What is the first advantage I said? That you can quickly understand the entire process system easily compared to the narrative notes, which could be a time-consuming process because you'll have to read the entire narrative note to understand the purchase control system. Another advantage of using flowchart would be that it is easy to spot any missing internal controls. Okay, so let's have a look at some more advantages and disadvantages. Okay, why don't we start with you guys. Let me try and understand some of the disadvantages that you guys think a flowchart would have. And then we will look at the notes.
Could it be misinterpretations?
Misinterpretation, yes. Not necessary that everybody would understand flowchart in the same way like you do. Correct? There can be misinterpretations. Good. What else? Any other disadvantage?
Not enough information, limited information.
That's the trick about using flowcharts. You want to show the entire process, but with key information or limited information, right? So you're going to include all the control activities. Okay.
So if we are doing it in the middle of the year, then we won't have the whole information.
No, see, internal control systems, you don't have to wait for the year end to get over. Right? Purchase तो start of the year भी हो सकता है, end of the year भी purchase करते हैं, और process तो same ही रहेगा, right? आपको purchase order generate करना पड़ेगा, purchases invoice receive होगा, उसके बाद you receive the goods from the vendor, you make an entry in your record, वो तो control same ही रहता है. So was that what you were asking?
Yeah.
So it remains the same. See, some other disadvantages could be that ऐसा method कब suitable रहता है कि जब हम transactions जैसे कि routine transactions होते हैं. For very unusual or non-routine transactions, this particular method of documenting controls would not be suitable. जैसे कि domestic purchases or domestic sales. For an Indian company, domestic local sales and local purchases is quite routine. But maybe they want to purchase a raw material and it is only available in China. So that is something which is a non-routine transaction. So for that, the controls will be, there might be different additional set of controls that the organization will have to follow. So in that situation, flowcharts may not be so suitable. Okay. Then if you want to make any changes, for example, any kind of control you missed to add, and then you later discovered that it had to be added, then it requires redrafting the entire flowchart, which is going to be a time-consuming process. तो वापस से आपको draw करना पड़ेगा, वापस से linkages आपको करने पड़ेंगे. तो it is a time-consuming process if it requires modification. Okay, some advantages. What could you say? What you guys could say? Some advantages of flowcharts, apart from what we already discussed.
It's not complicated as compared to narrative notes.
Okay. I would not entirely agree to that. Narrative notes are actually simple. No? You don't have to see. Sometimes preparing a flowchart requires a certain set of skills. Not everybody knows how to prepare flowcharts because you need to have start symbol and you need to learn how to use the right symbols for different types of activities. Okay, so in that example that I was trying to show you, there are certain symbols, right? Like, let me show that once again to you guys. See, as you could see here, there are these X. If this signifies something, these symbols do signify something, right? They are used there for a purpose. So not everybody will understand flowcharts. So that also could be one other disadvantage. And at the same time, what you could say is, it is, I wouldn't say it is more complicated, but it is put in a more, see, anything that is visual is more easy than something which is so textual and lengthier.
Ma'am, so flowchart is basically steps, right?
Yes, it is put in a step format, but in a visual way.
So one of the advantage can be it is easy for someone else to understand the process.
Again, those who know how a flowchart works, for them it would be easy.
Those who doesn't know.
Those who don't understand the technicalities of it, for them it might not be that simple. Okay, अब मैं एक और आपको I'll try to show you one more example of how a flowchart might look like. So can you see here again these symbols? You're using rectangles and then arrow marks, and then for again you have yes or no. I'm sure you would have seen flowcharts somewhere. No? But this is
No, I didn't.
okay, fine. No problem. But this is how a flowchart looks like. So if you look at this, you don't have to read the entire text. You know that अभी ये material का process है. Purchase of raw material का process डाला हुआ है. So you know that how it begins, what is the start initial activity, how the initiation happens. Okay, so it is much more easier to understand that way, and it's not that complicated. Again, to understand this better and to interpret this better, somebody who has a technical knowledge about flowcharts will only understand, otherwise it will be misinterpreted, like how some earlier some student pointed out. Okay. So yeah, so it here helps you understand the process in a much more logical format. So that's all about the flowchart. The next type of method is questionnaire. That's the third type of method. Okay. Now, there are two types of questionnaires. One is the internal control questionnaire and internal control evaluation questionnaire. So there is control missing in the second one. Internal control evaluation questionnaire, ICEQ. The questionnaire, as we know the drill, how it works is, it is a set of questions that is prepared by the auditor and given to the client. Jaise ki, do you have a purchase order? Is a purchase order system, purchase order generated for every purchase? And you have an answer there, yes or no. Or you will not just give any options, and you will give a small space for the client to write in about to write about that process. That yes, there is a purchase order, or the client will say no, purchase orders are only created for purchases about $10,000. Something like that. So that is why you have two types of questionnaires. So the first type that I told you, where you're giving the option, that is called as internal control questionnaire. So it comes with a set of questions and as well as options, and you have to choose from those options. Whereas the internal control evaluation questionnaire, which is the other type, is where you don't give the options, but you're giving a small space for the client to fill in the answer. So if you ask, yes, is a purchase order present for every purchases, they would say yes or no, or they will have some further explanation to it. See, question asked generates a yes or no response. So like certain examples of internal control questionnaires are, is a regular inventory count performed? And you would have a yes or no option there. Is a bank reconciliation performed regularly? Okay. Whereas if you look at internal control evaluation questionnaire, alternate in this method, the questions are framed in such a way that an affirmative response must alert the auditor that there exist deficiencies within the system with objectives not being met. So what happens here, yahan pe kya karenge log? To show a better picture to the auditor, they will simply mark yes for everything. Like even when we have to fill questionnaires to enroll for a course or maybe to get into a college, we would like to, it always looks good to keep ticking on yes, 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 right? So similarly for internal control, even in case of doing audit for a client, they might say, yes, we have performed regular inventory counts or bank reconciliations are regularly performed, but we won't get details about how regularly are bank reconciliations performed. Okay, so if sometimes client might tick yes, why? Because it is performed once every quarter. But that's not regularly as per the auditor. Why? Because bank reconciliations should be prepared every month. That's the control we will learn when we are discussing cash and bank system. So if you are framing the same question for an internal evaluation questionnaire, the auditor, the client will say that it is performed only once in 3 months, because there's an option for them to write the answer. So then immediately that time itself, this will alert the auditor, and that's a deficiency because once in 3 months is not regularly. The actual control is that bank reconciliations must be performed every month end. So that's deficiency which they can easily pick up from these questionnaires. But I won't say that internal control questionnaires are not suitable at all. In certain situations, in certain circumstances, it is suitable. Sometimes what the auditor does is they take a blend of both of these. So a hybrid kind of questionnaire is prepared. Some questions are yes or no, and some questions there are no options available, and the client has the option to type in the answer. And here the certain other type of questions that you can ask an internal control questionnaire, evaluation questionnaire, is how does the company ensure goods are only purchased for a valid business use? So there are questions which are not yes or no type also. How does a company ensure that the non-current asset register is up to the date and accurate? So asking these questions, you are getting more and detailed information, and you can't capture such detailed information for internal control questionnaires. So I have you guys first of all understood the two types of questionnaires.
Yes, ma'am.
What about others?
Yes, ma'am.
So energy seems to be a little low today. What happened? How is the preparation going on? Were you guys told anything about the test? An exam?
Yes.
I can't. Are you guys speaking? Because I can't hear you guys clearly. Hello?
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so were you guys told about the test?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and which all like sections? Oh, was it put in the Discord group? Actually, let me just look. So how is the preparation going on? Because I see a lot of you guys have already started, solving questions from practice kit, revision kit. And it's good to see that I try to revert to a few of you guys by correcting those questions. So I want more of you guys to start doing such questions. You can ask me to correct it, or you can yourself evaluate with the answer available. Okay. On Monday. So let's look at certain advantages and disadvantages of questionnaire. Yeah. Yes, Abhinav, I agree to you. It's a little theory paper. So usually theory papers are difficult for some students. But if you're able to understand and then study, then it becomes easier. Plus, the advantage is, unlike the other exams, you don't have to rote learn the definitions as such. Understand the concept and apply it to the case studies. And you can only become more confident if you solve as many number of questions. Okay. Advantages of questionnaire. So cost effective, as it is easy to prepare. This also can highlight missing controls, and it's easy to understand because it is in a typical Q&A format. Disadvantage would be easy for a company to overstate the level of controls. That's what I told you before. Over here, this happens that the disadvantage is more applicable if the auditor is choosing internal control questionnaire method, where only yes and no options are available. So in that situation, most of the time, what happens is the client wants to keep ticking yes, 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 but maybe those controls are not performed regularly or they are not reviewed regularly. Maybe the whole process is not working the way it should be, but all that details cannot be captured. So that way, just by ticking yes, there's a lot of overstatement of controls and they actually exist. And you have to keep modifying the questionnaires. The same set of questionnaires can't be used. It needs to be tailored, made to a specific company. I think this disadvantage could be even for flowcharts, which needs to be modified or changed for every different type of industry and company. So this is how a question could be asked in your main examination. Auditors are required to document a company's accounting and internal control system as a part of their audit process. Two methods available for documenting internal control systems are narrative notes and questionnaire. Required for each of the two methods, narrative notes and questionnaire, describe the method and explain an advantage of using this method. And then there's a fourth method that I was talking about, right? Which is not included in the notes. So you guys can just take it down quickly in your notebooks. The fourth method is called as the checklist approach. Now, checklist, under that you can write down statements are made by the auditor. You want me to write it down in the Word document?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So like I said, there are a lot of similarities between questionnaire and checklist. Of course, questionnaires are more, they're only questions that are being asked, but checklist can either be only statements made by the auditor, and then there will be check boxes or tick boxes besides those statements for client to, choose the right or the most suitable option. But sometimes it can also be in the form of questions, and there can be yes or no check boxes. Because of this reason, they have the same merits and this demerits of the questionnaire. Example could be purchase order is prepared by Mr. A and that's all. So with that, we have completed 4 different methods.
Ma'am, for every statement, will there be a checkbox?
Yes, there will be a checkbox. Okay, so if everyone is clear with this, we go to the next topic, which is test of controls. Shall we?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. So that also I will discuss here only. Now, what is test of controls? Is everyone comfortable like this, or do you want me to go through the notes? Can I use the Word document? Or you want me to go to the notes? I will ensure that I'm covering everything from the notes, so don't worry about that. I just want to understand what is more comfortable.
Ma'am, Word document.
Word.
Word document. Okay. Some of your audios are not clear, but we'll go for the Word document. Test of controls are otherwise also called as TOC. So we'll be using TOCs. You can use this short form even for your exam. What happens in test of control is just like how the title says, the auditor here will be testing the controls that are in place, that are already existing. Okay. Now, why does the auditor do that? Because, like I said earlier, when I was just trying to explain here, right? Why does he do that? Because he wants to see that whether these internal controls are working effectively or not. If these internal controls in these different processes are not working effectively, definitely the financial statements are not prepared correctly, right? So that's his objective. That's the reason why the auditors are testing the controls. Now, certain methods or audit procedures for testing the controls, how do you do that? How do you test? How do you test a purchase order exists? Like I told you that I've been telling you right from the beginning that purchase order is one of the control in purchase systems, right? So how does an auditor check that? Any thoughts? How do you think the auditor would check a purchase order?
The invoices, purchase invoices.
Okay. Purchase invoices. But purchase order, acha. Okay, let me tell you this. Purchase order is a separate document. I think some of you didn't get that. Purchase order is a separate document generated. Purchase invoice is a document that you receive later on from your vendor. So, in the purchase invoice, there is a purchase order reference number given. कि ये invoice कौन से purchase order reference purchase order number को reference करता है? जैसे कि let me tell you that a company has Now, this is a very key discussion that we're doing right now. Please understand and listen to this carefully, because we will be using this same thing when we are going to discuss our purchase system. So I'm already discussing a little bit of purchase system right now. So I won't be going so in detail, because I will use references to our discussion right now. Okay, so please pay attention. So you have purchase orders, purchase order number generated for every purchase. So for every purchase, a purchase sequence number or generated order number is generated. So let's say 001. You have placed order for 100 items of item of A, product A, or for raw material A. Okay, then after that, you've understood that you need more of the same product later on. You need some additional 200 items. So this was made somewhere on the 1st of June, 2020. And this was made on the 15th of June. Now, usually, like how we guys go and purchase from a shop, it is instantly that we receive goods, right? But it may not be, that's not how it might necessarily work in bigger organization. Maybe to produce or to get these raw materials of A, it needs to be processed by the manufacturer or your vendor. So it might take some time. So usually they say that if you want to purchase a product, you need to give us a 2 weeks prior purchase order notice, or purchase order 2 weeks before you actually need the goods. Okay, so by then what happens is you are receiving the goods for first order. Let's say this is invoice number 210, where you're receiving, where you have got goods for the first order that you placed on the 1st of June. And you will have reference to purchase order number 001 in every invoice. Okay, so from the client perspective, they will be able to trace and track that for every purchases that they have, purchase order that they have placed with their vendor, have they received those goods or not? And maybe what happens is that you have another invoice, invoice number 211, received 100, not 100, now just 200, reference given to purchase order 1 and 2. So this is one way. You will receive the goods differently for each purchase order, but sometimes what happens is, in order to save on the logistics cost and the transportation cost, the vendor would send only one invoice and deliver the goods at once itself. So maybe no 2 separate invoices, but this in one invoice itself, they will send total orders, all the 2 orders. Okay, so how does the auditor check if there is a separate purchase, like how does the auditor verify purchase orders? They'll have to ask the client to give the purchase orders document. A purchase order document needs to be presented to the auditor. So the word that you will use will be inspect. Inspect purchase orders. Inspection of purchase purchase order forms, or you would say inspect purchase invoices and examine to which, or verify, sorry, not examine, or verify to which purchase order do they relate to. This is how a purchase order looks like. Just a format of it. PO number, PO date, vendor ID. For every supplier, you have an ID, which is a unique code for every vendor. Where do you want to purchase from? Where do you want to ship it to? The different items, quantities, unit price, who has approved it, and what is the total. So basically, let's now try to write a little bit about test of controls. Test of controls is TOC is performed by the external auditor to assess whether the internal control systems are designed and is operating effectively and efficiently. Is performed only for those internal control systems that have direct effect on the financial statements. Next important point is that the results from TOC will determine the level of substantive procedures to be performed. Now, substantive procedures is the next section that we will deal with once we are done with internal controls. So once the auditor has, performed TOC, wherein they're going to inspect a lot of documents like purchase order forms, purchase invoices, then purchase registers, if any, if it is maintained by the client. So if such, inspections are done and TOCs are performed, then you will be able to assess, the external auditor will be able to assess whether the internal controls are working effectively or not, whether the internal controls are strong or not, right? So the results from TOC could either be whether controls are strong or weak. Okay? And if the controls, the results could either be that the controls are strong or the controls are weak. If the controls are strong, then you will perform less substantive procedures. If the controls are weak, then you will perform more substantive procedures. What are substantive procedures? These are audit procedures performed, like analytical procedure is one substantive procedure. Then vouching is another substantive procedure. We will learn substantive procedures also. It's a different section. We will learn it after we finish discussion on internal controls. So these are certain important points with respect to test of controls. And what are the procedures that you do in test of controls? Okay. Number one, first is that you inspect the documents. Then you also will perform inquiry with the staffs and the concerned employees. Then you also have another procedure called as re-performance and observation. I'll give you examples for each of it, don't worry. Performance. Inspection of documents, I've already given you an example where you're inspect the purchase order forms or purchase invoices. See, all the documents will only be inspected. So you have to use the right terms. What are those terms? Inspection is a term. It's an audit procedure. Inquiry, re-performance, and observation. Inquiry, example would be you want to just talk to the purchase clerk to understand how and when a purchase order is generated for one particular product. So it is simply discussion with the concerned staff. Re-performance, on the other hand, would be, for example, wherever there are calculations involved, you might have to re-perform or recalculate. So, for example, preparing the BRS. What is BRS? Bank reconciliation statement. Or another example could also be the performance of depreciation calculation. The client would have prepared a depreciation schedule. You just want to assess whether the calculations and the arithmetical accuracies are correct. You have to re-perform it. Observation of control. One example is physical verification of PP&E or inventory. Right? And this is something which the client cannot, when they are doing, the client also will have to do physical verification of assets at least once a year. So now whether that physical verification is done or not, that for the auditor will have to go there and observe. That's the only way that the auditor can assess whether this control is performed or not. So certain times you might not have the documents. You can't even, there's a limitation up to how much you can gather evidences through the inquiry. So the best way is the auditor directly observing those controls. So it comes under observation of controls. Everybody is clear with the procedures that you should use for TOC? Okay. Then the next thing is once the test of controls are performed, a report is generated wherein the report will highlight the weaknesses, the control weaknesses to the management. Now, this is given in a form of a letter, which is called as a letter on internal controls, or even called as a management letter, which is prepared by the auditor and given to the management of the organization after they have tested their controls, wherein they will highlight what the weaknesses they have identified in different control testings that they performed, and they will classify these weaknesses, whether it is relating to design deficiency or is it relating to operational deficiencies. See, the terminology that you should use in your exam is deficiency, internal control deficiency, or internal control weakness. Now, the deficiency arises if the internal controls are not designed properly, or the deficiency could arise because internal controls are designed, but they are not operating effectively because of carelessness of the employees or because they are not properly monitored. So that is resulting in operational deficiencies. So what happens once the management receives this letter on internal control from the auditor? They will be asked to rectify those weaknesses. Sorry. They'll be asked to rectify those weaknesses, or the recommendations that will be given by the auditor will have to be implemented by the management. External audit. So if you have understood this process, when we actually discuss uh, the different systems like purchase system, CI system, you should be able to tell the examiner how you will test these controls. So understanding of internal controls in different uh, subjects is very important, like for sales, for purchases, for cash and bank. Only then you will be able to write the test of controls, because in your exam you will have this kind of a requirement. Exam requirement is like this. Identify the control deficiency and describe the test of controls and recommend the internal controls for the deficiency. For test of control, they will ask you to also identify the internal controls from the case study. So they'll give you a case study and they'll ask you what are the different internal controls. For those internal controls, identify those first and then describe the test of controls. How would you test those controls? And then they will also ask you identify the deficiencies that you can see or the weaknesses and recommend internal controls for these identified deficiencies. Now, the thing is, they might not ask you to do all of this at once. They might ask you either 2 of these things or maybe 3 of these things in your exam. And the maximum number of, like this is a highly weighted section in your examination, it can come up to 15 to 20 marks, this particular area. Okay. Have you all taken down the notes so far? Shall I go to the LMS? Hello?
Yes.
Okay. So here I told you that the management will be made aware about what the deficiencies are by the external auditor. So in that situation, what are the matters that the external auditor should consider? Whether these deficiencies are significant or not. Like, are they really major or not? There are certain deficiencies which would be minor, or in other words, immaterial. But we don't use the word materiality when we talk, whenever we talk internal controls. Whenever we speak about internal controls, we don't use the term materiality. Okay, what we use is either the deficiency could be insignificant or it could be significant. So just one more thing. The deficiency could be insignificant or it could be significant. And when we talk from financial statements perspective, we say misstatement. Instead of the word efficiency, you should use the word misstatement in your answers. And the misstatements again can be not insignificant, rather you will say immaterial. And instead of saying significant, you will say material. So you should note how these wordings must change in your answers depending on what type of question you're answering. If you're answering anything relating to audit risk, right? The previous section that we have covered in the last weeks, audit risk or anything relating to audit procedures that we will have a look at in the next section. So there you should talk about, you should use the words misstatement, materiality, immaterial. And today, when we're discussing internal controls, you need to focus on deficiency, using the word deficiency. So how does the auditor determine, see, insignificant deficiencies, the auditor can actually overlook, and they need to focus on significant deficiency. So how does the auditor determine whether a deficiency is significant or not? So that's what we're going to have a look at next. So for that, the auditor will have to see whether these deficiencies are going to cause any kind of material misstatement in the financial statement. If that's the case, then that deficiency becomes significant. Now you all understanding that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, if any deficiency, if the auditor feels that such deficiencies are going to cause fraud or a big loss to the organization, so if the auditor suspects that such deficiencies are going to cause loss or fraud, or if it relates to any estimates, such as what the different estimates that you can have, things like provisions, depreciation method, depreciation useful life of the assets. So these are all different estimates. So if the internal control relates to such areas, or if it is going to result into a fraud, then again such deficiencies are significant. So there can be some direct theory question in your exam. Again, very rare it's going to be asked, but if at all they ask you, you should be aware about different factors that can determine whether deficiency is significant or not. Then the amounts exposed to those deficiencies. So if you've identified a deficiency, invoice purchase invoice ही नहीं है, for example, and the value of worth of goods that you have bought is around 10 lakh rupees, and that's a huge amount, right? So again, that is a deficiency. That internal purchase invoice does not exist because the amount involved is 10 lakh rupees, it is material. So definitely that deficiency is significant. And the volume of activity. So if the third point, if it is relating to the amount, this is in terms of volume of activity. So number. So you have received 10,000 units, and for that you don't have invoices at all. So if it is just 1 or 2 units or 1 or 2 items for which you don't have invoice, it's okay, it is insignificant. But if it is 1 lakh number of units you have received and उसके लिए कोई purchase order नहीं है, कोई भी purchase invoices नहीं account किया है, so that is again a significant deficiency. So I hope these 4 factors are clear to everybody. And in this auditor's report, wherein these internal control deficiencies are highlighted, what are these reports called as? I told you, a letter on internal control, or it is also called as the management letter, right? Or a letter of weakness. So in this report, the auditor should make it clear that this is not a comprehensive list of deficiencies. That means a complete list nahi hai. Whatever the auditor has audited and whatever they have, they came across during the audit process, only those have been identified and highlighted to the management. And that report is only for the use of the company. It cannot be used by anybody else. It cannot be disclosed to the third party without the prior permission from the auditor. And I also spoke about deciding the extent of substantive testing or the substantive audit procedures. It is dependent on whether the internal controls are strong or not. So as I said, if the internal controls are strong, the substantive testing will be less. If the internal controls are weak, you will have to do more substantive testing, which we will discuss in the later chapters, like I said. So this is an important section. What have we discussed so far? Let us just have a recap of whatever we discussed so far, so you guys would be clear. So since morning, what have we discussed? We have discussed 4 different methods and the advantages, disadvantages. Narrative notes, flowcharts, questionnaire, and checklist. Okay. After that, what did we discuss? We discussed about test of controls. What test of controls are? What are the controls that the external auditor will look at? Only those controls that have direct effect on the financial statement. What are the procedures, the 4 procedures that we do in TOC? Inspection, inquiry, re-performance, and observation. And the results of these TOC will determine the level of substantive testing or substantive procedures to be performed. and they are inversely related, right? If the after the test of controls, if the auditor sees that the controls are working fine, they are strong, the level of substantive testing will be less, and vice versa. Then we looked at, there's a report that is generated after the testing of these controls. That report is also called as the letter of weakness or letter on internal controls, which is given to the management. Then we looked at the different 4 factors which the auditor will have to look at to determine whether deficiency is significant or not. What were those 4 factors? Can anyone tell? Now, is there any specific reason why today, especially, everybody is quiet? Is it the exam tension that you are going to have to, write your exam next week? Or is it something else? So there's a lot of background noise. Is it from my end or? Okay, what about others then? No one, if you can type also is fine, Kunal. That's okay. What are the 4 different factors that determine that whether a deficiency is significant or not? So I help you with the first one. First one is if that internal control deficiency is going to result in a material misstatement for an item in the financial statement, then that is a significant deficiency. What are the other types, other factors?
About the likelihood of fraud.
Yes, very good. Fraud, likelihood of fraud, Jenny, correct? Then
Volume of activities.
volume of activity, and one more.
Amount of activity.
Yes, amount involved in that deficiency that you've identified. Very good. What will the auditor have to make sure when they are giving this report to the management? What should the auditor make clear to the management when they give the report to the management on internal control deficiencies?
That it does not involve, like, they're not evaluated or check all the deficiencies, but these are the deficiencies which were checked when they were performing the normal audit procedure.
Okay, very good. And yes, Jenny, it is only for the sole use of the company.
No disclosure should be made to a third party.
Yes, very good. No disclosure should be made to a third party without the permission of the auditor. If the auditor permits, you can disclose. Now, next, we are going to have a look at the limitations on internal controls. So we can't say that internal control systems are going to be perfect, even if the internal controls exist. Okay, why? Because there are certain limitations inherent limitations, they're called, which means these limitations cannot be brought to minimum. They cannot be avoided at all. They are inherent. So what are those? Number one is the cost is greater than the benefits. Sometimes to have a security guard or to have a CCTV camera to monitor whether the CCTV camera is working properly, to set up that system, these are physical controls that I'm talking about. Similarly, when we talk about sales process, you have to have segregation of duties. That's a very common control activity for every type of process. So having two employees, one is to prepare, the other one is to oversee and authorize that particular process. So to do all these things, it requires a lot of setting up cost, training cost, monitoring cost. So the cost always is greater than the benefit sometimes from it. But obviously, as the organization is big, or if the size of the organization is big, they can afford it. But for smaller organization, it is very expensive affair. Then risk of overriding of controls by the management. That's the second limitation. What does that mean? Even if the controls are existing, they can be bypassed by the higher authorities because they are in the position of authority and power. So they can use that authority and power and bypass a lot of these controls. Then the third limitation is that internal controls sometimes cannot cater to non-routine transactions. Like I spoke about how if a company is only doing domestic purchases, but sometimes some special raw material will only be available overseas, you have to, and that's one of those cases. One of such cases where you have to make a international purchase. So that's a non-routine transaction. In such a situation, the existing internal controls will not be applicable for such a type of non-routine transactions. The fourth limitation is possibility of human error. Even if you're telling you have a control called as purchase order, but when the purchase order is generated, who is generating a purchase order for? A human being, right? At the end of the day, who is monitoring the CCTV? A human being. So if something is being stolen during the midnight and there is CCTV camera, but it is not monitored, how, if nobody is watching the CCTV camera overnight, then how is it going to actually catch the fraud? Or if there is somebody monitoring it, but that person dozed off. So again, because of human error, there is something that you could not actually catch hold of that theft. Similarly, if the purchase orders are the input, if you have put in the wrong supplier ID, again, prone to human error by mistake. Then collusion between employees resulting in the possibility of fraud. So again, if there are disagreements between the employees, or if the employees, they want to, they are all they mutually plan to do a fraud, then in that case, even the higher authorities are involved, then in that case, you definitely cannot, catch hold of, you can't have the best benefits of setting up internal control. And if certain internal controls are out of date or they are not designed in such a way which can accommodate a change in the business conditions, or they are not modified or changed or updated, then again, it can be a disadvantage to a company. This is also important. You'll have to study these things. So whatever I've told you right now, I've also explained the marks that can be, the number of marks that can come from this section, what type of questions, what areas you need to focus on. You please have to make note of all these things and prioritize and study for your exam. So those were the disadvantages. So with that, we have completed this section.